40 years later, the most famous reactor in the world is still hidden in plain sight. From a distance, the great steel arch over reactor number 4 looks like a triumph of engineering, a clean curve against the flat sky of northern Ukraine. Up close, it feels like something else, a giant bandage over a wound that never fully closed. Behind that steel lies the remains of a reactor that exploded in the early hours of April 26, 1986. Around it stands the debris of a vanished Soviet future. Apartment towers, schools, a hospital, sports grounds, a fairground prepared for spring, and then abandoned before the rides could open. Trees fill courtyards. Wind moves through broken windows. The clocks stopped long ago. The danger did not. The Soviet Union that built this place no longer exists. Its flag is gone. Its slogans are gone. Its leaders are dead. But Chernobyl remained after the men who designed it, after the officials who lied about it, after the state that insisted it had everything under control. That is what makes this disaster different from an ordinary industrial accident. Chernobyl was not only an explosion, it was a revelation. It exposed what happened when an entire political system trained itself to value certainty over truth, obedience over doubt, prestige over caution. And because radiation does not care about ideology, the consequences crossed borders, generations, and regimes. To understand how Chernobyl outlived the Soviet Union, we have to return to a time when the atom was supposed to represent the future. After the Second World War, nuclear power became one of the great symbols of superpower modernity. The atom could destroy cities, but it could also light them. It could power submarines, factories, apartment blocks, and dreams. For the Soviet Union, nuclear energy was not just engineering, it was prestige. It was proof that history moved in Moscow's direction. To build reactors was to announce that socialism could master nature, science, and the future itself. The plant that became known to the world as Chernobyl was built in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, not far from the border with Belarus. The nearby town of Chernobyl gave the station its name, but the city most bound to its fate was Pripyat, a young purpose-built community created for the plant's workers and their families. Pripyat was founded in 1970. It was modern, clean, orderly, and astonishingly young. The average resident was in their 20s. This was where engineers, technicians, teachers, doctors, and children were supposed to live the good Soviet life. Educated, urban, optimistic, close to nature, but even closer to progress. Pripyat had wide avenues, apartment blocks, schools, music rooms, sports centers, shops, cafes, and a river nearby. It had the confidence of a city built all at once, with none of the crooked age of older European towns. It was a city of straight lines, fresh paint, and official optimism. Families moved there because the future seemed to be arriving in real time. They had better jobs than many Soviet citizens, better housing than many could dream of, and a sense of belonging to something important. The nuclear plant beside them was not feared. It was a source of pride. By the mid-1980s, the Chernobyl nuclear power station was one of the largest in the Soviet Union. 4 reactors were in operation, and more were planned. The machine at the center of the disaster was an RBMK reactor, a massive design with roots in Soviet engineering priorities that mixed civilian energy goals with choices shaped by the wider military-industrial culture. It was powerful. It was efficient in certain ways. It could be refueled while running, which made it attractive for continuous operation. But it also carried deep vulnerabilities, especially under unstable conditions. To understand the danger, it helps to understand one ugly phrase: positive void coefficient. In many reactors, when cooling water turns to steam, the nuclear reaction tends to slow down. In the RBMK, especially at low power, the opposite could happen. As more steam bubbles formed in the coolant, reactivity could rise. In plain language, the reactor could become more unstable exactly when operators needed it to calm down. That was not the only problem. The reactor used graphite as a moderator and water as coolant, a combination that behaved in complex ways. It also lacked the kind of full containment structure common at many Western plants. And hidden inside its emergency shutdown system was a design flaw so bitterly ironic that it still shocks engineers. In certain conditions, pressing the shutdown button could briefly increase reactivity before reducing it. Design flaws alone do not cause catastrophe. Machines fail all the time without entering world history. What turned Chernobyl into a disaster was the meeting point between flawed design and flawed culture. The Soviet system around the reactor rewarded plan fulfillment, routine, obedience, and the appearance of confidence. It did not reward hesitation. It did not always reward bad news. Information about reactor weaknesses was not always clearly shared with the people expected to operate them. Safety existed in procedures, but prestige existed in politics, and prestige had a way of leaning on procedures until they bent. This was the deeper architecture of the disaster, not only steel and graphite, but hierarchy and silence. The Soviet Union excelled at large systems. It could build giant dams, railways, missile programs, and nuclear complexes. But giant systems can teach dangerous habits. They can teach people to normalize risk. They can teach managers to keep operations smooth at any cost. They can teach subordinates that questioning a plan is more dangerous than executing it. The result is a culture that looks efficient until the moment it is asked to tell the truth. The test scheduled for April 25, 1986, sounded technical and limited. Its purpose was to answer a practical question. If the plant lost outside electrical power, could the momentum of the spinning turbine generate enough electricity just for a short gap to keep the cooling pumps running until the backup diesel generators reached full speed? It was an emergency power question, narrow and procedural, the kind of thing that should have ended as a line in a report. Instead, it became the most infamous test in the history of nuclear energy. The plan was to shut down reactor number 4 for routine maintenance and perform the turbine rundown test during the process. The reactor's power began to come down as scheduled, but the schedule did not remain clean. Grid authorities requested that the plant delay the full reduction because more electricity was still needed on the network, so the reactor remained at reduced power for many hours longer than intended. That mattered. It changed the reactor's internal chemistry. It set the stage for instability. As the hours passed, xenon built up in the core. Xenon is a fission product that absorbs neutrons, and in reactors it can act like a poison, suppressing power after a reduction. By the time the operators resumed the power descent late that night, the reactor no longer behaved the way they wanted. Its output sank too far, dropping to an extremely low level. It should not have been there. Under stable planning, the test might have been postponed. Under a healthier safety culture, the answer might have been simple. Stop, reset, begin again another day. But the momentum of the system pushed the other way. The operators attempted to bring the power back up. To do that, they withdrew more control rods than regulations allowed. They recovered some power, but not to the intended level. The reactor settled into an unstable low-power condition, with too few control rods in the core and a dangerously narrow operating margin. Cooling water flow remained high. Steam production was low. The machine was alive, but it was no longer healthy. It had become, in the most dangerous sense, difficult to predict. Some safety systems were disabled or bypassed to prevent the test from being interrupted. That fact has often been reduced to a morality tale about reckless men breaking rules. The truth is worse, because it is more ordinary. The operators were working inside a system that had normalized procedural bending in the name of mission success. They were not cartoon villains trying to cause an explosion. They were technicians under pressure. Navigating a badly designed reactor In a culture that did not fully honor the possibility of stopping, Chernobyl was not caused by one evil man, one stupid worker, or one single button. It was caused by a fatal intersection of design flaws, procedural violations, poor communication, and a system that had forgotten how to doubt itself. Close to 1:23 in the morning, on April 26th, the test began. Steam to the turbine was cut off. As the turbine coasted down, the pumps it powered began to slow. Water flow changed. More steam voids formed in the core. In an RBMK under those conditions, that meant reactivity could climb. What should have been a quiet engineering observation became the beginning of a runaway event. The reactor started to surge. Inside the control room, the seconds that followed have been reconstructed again and again, not because anyone wants to relive them, but because the world has needed to understand how such a machine could tear itself apart. At 1:23:40, the emergency shutdown button, AZ5, was pressed. In theory, this should have ended the danger. In practice, because of the control rod's graphite tips and the unstable condition of the core, the insertion produced a brief and catastrophic spike in reactivity. Fuel channels ruptured. Steam exploded through the reactor. A second explosion followed. The top of the reactor was blown apart. The building was shattered. The core was opened to the night sky. It is important to say what the explosion was not. It was not a nuclear bomb. There was no mushroom cloud of the kind associated with atomic warfare. But for everyone nearby, that distinction offered no comfort. The blast tore the reactor building open, ignited fires, hurled radioactive debris onto roofs and ground, and exposed the graphite moderator to air. Graphite began to burn. The reactor, which should never have been visible at all, had become a crater of fire, rubble, and invisible poison. And yet, in the first moments after the explosion, many of the people responsible for managing the crisis still could not fully believe what had happened. The idea that the core itself was gone seemed almost impossible. Some available radiation meters maxed out at levels far below the true readings, which encouraged deadly self-deception. If the instruments insist the numbers are not too high, and the event itself seems unthinkable, institutions often choose the instrument over reality. Men were sent to inspect the building, open doors, look into rooms, and report what remained. They walked into radiation fields so intense that many did not understand what was happening to them until their bodies began to fail. Around the plant, alarms, fires, and confusion spread through the darkness. Emergency crews responded as they had been trained to respond to industrial accidents by fighting flames, protecting equipment, and keeping adjacent structures from catching fire. Firefighters arrived believing they were confronting a roof blaze and electrical damage after an explosion. They climbed onto buildings and carried hoses across debris that was not ordinary debris at all. Some black fragments lying on the ground were pieces of graphite from the reactor core itself, intensely radioactive and still warm. Men picked them up without understanding what they were touching. In the hours that followed, many firefighters and plant staff began to feel a metallic taste in their mouths. Some vomited. Some felt weakness, dizziness, or burning sensations. At first, these symptoms were confusing. Radiation is silent, odorless, and invisible. It does not announce itself with the drama of flame. It moves inside tissue, inside bone marrow, inside cells. That invisibility was one of Chernobyl's deepest cruelties. People could stand in mortal danger and still feel they were merely tired, stressed, overheated, or unlucky. Inside the control room and around the wrecked reactor, plant workers tried to make sense of the impossible. Some continued attempting to pump water into what they believed was an intact core. They were operating under the logic of an accident that no longer existed. The reactor was gone. But the human mind does not accept that kind of transformation quickly. The men on duty had spent years learning how to manage a reactor, not how to imagine its absence. Several of them kept working even after receiving lethal doses because the discipline of the workplace had outlived the workplace itself. As dawn approached, the fire still burned. A strange glow hung over the destroyed unit. The plume rising from the exposed reactor carried radioactive isotopes high into the atmosphere, where wind would do what governments could not control. Chernobyl's contamination was already leaving the plant site and crossing the landscape. But nearby, normal life had not yet stopped. By morning, Pripyat woke to a Saturday unlike any other. And, at first glance, unlike no other at all. Buses ran. People shopped. Children played. Residents looked from balconies toward the plant and noticed smoke, lights, and an unusual glow. Some went outside to watch. Some stood on overpasses and riverbanks. Some pointed out the beauty of the strange color in the sky. They had not been told they were breathing fallout from an open reactor. They had not been told that particles were settling on clothes, hair, windowsills, playgrounds, and prams. This was one of the most haunting aspects of Chernobyl, the ordinary day continuing beside an invisible emergency. In films, disasters come with sirens, crowds, and immediate recognition. Chernobyl gave people almost none of that. It gave them uncertainty, half information, and delay. The city had been built to trust official calm, and official calm remained in place long after it should have collapsed. At the plant, radiation levels forced a crisis response on a scale far beyond local capability. Officials in Kiev and Moscow began to grasp the severity of the event, but the machinery of decision-making moved through fear, denial, and political caution. News of major accidents did not travel easily in the Soviet Union, especially news that could embarrass the state. What could be admitted? Who could say it? How much panic would truth create? These were the instincts of a secretive power confronting a danger that secrecy could only worsen. Pripyat was not evacuated immediately. That delay has become one of the defining moral facts of the disaster. For roughly 36 hours after the explosion, tens of thousands of people remained in the contaminated city. Some windows were left open. Children were outdoors. Food and water were consumed. Families waited for instruction because in a centralized system, people are trained to wait for instruction. Delay became exposure. When the evacuation order finally came on the afternoon of April 27th, fleets of buses arrived. The message to residents was brief and calming. They were told to take documents, some belongings, and enough supplies for a short absence. They were told they would be away for only a few days. That sentence echoes across the entire history of Chernobyl. Only a few days. Most of them would never live in Pripyat again. People left with bags, coats, papers, and confusion. They closed apartment doors thinking they would return. They left toys on beds, dishes in cupboards, laundry on lines, and pets in courtyards. Parents carried children to buses. Old people looked back from windows. The evacuation was efficient in the narrow logistical sense. The buses came. The city emptied. But emotional efficiency is another thing. A whole urban life was severed in an afternoon and preserved in place like an interrupted sentence. The Ferris wheel in Pripyat has since become one of the most recognizable images in modern history. It stood in the amusement park that was meant to open for May Day celebrations. Children were supposed to ride it. Music was supposed to play there. Instead, it became a symbol of a future that had been scheduled and then canceled. It is famous now precisely because it never served its purpose. It was built for joy and inherited only memory. Even as Pripyat emptied, the broader Soviet public still did not fully know what had happened. The truth would not arrive first through an official confession. It would arrive because radiation crossed a border before honesty did. On April 28th, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden detected abnormal radioactivity on their clothing and footwear. At first, they suspected a leak at their own facility. investigations quickly suggested the source lay elsewhere. As meteorologists and nuclear experts traced the pattern, the conclusion became impossible to ignore. A major release had occurred somewhere in the Soviet Union. The world learned what Moscow had not yet clearly said, because contamination could not be kept inside ideology. Fallout moved over Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Scandinavia, and farther into Europe. Rain brought radioactive material down in uneven patches, creating hotspots far from the reactor itself. Fields, forests, water, livestock, milk, mushrooms, and soil all became part of the story. Chernobyl was no longer a Soviet accident. It was an international event. Only after foreign detection and growing pressure did the Soviet authorities make a public statement. The first announcements were brief and deeply inadequate to the scale of the disaster. A reactor had been damaged. Measures were being taken. There was little sense of magnitude, little sense of uncertainty, and almost no sense of remorse. In the gap between what had happened and what was being admitted, trust began to die. For citizens inside the Soviet Union, Chernobyl became a crisis not only of safety, but of language. What words could people trust when official words had come so late and said so little? Rumors spread faster than facts. Families asked whether to keep children indoors, whether to drink milk, whether to leave town, whether rain was dangerous, whether vegetables were safe. In some places, protective measures were delayed or uneven. The hazard was real, but knowledge of the hazard arrived in fragments. Fear filled the spaces where truth should have been. May Day celebrations approached, and in parts of the Soviet Union, public life continued under a cloud of contamination and uncertainty. The rituals of the state persisted because states, like people, cling to routine when admitting disruption feels like admitting weakness. But Chernobyl had already done its work. It had shown millions of citizens that the state could fail in the most modern sector of its economy, and then fail again in how it spoke about that failure. Once the scale of the accident could no longer be denied, the next phase began. If the first phase of Chernobyl was explosion, the second was mobilization. The Soviet Union responded the way great centralized powers often respond to disaster, by summoning enormous numbers of people and resources. Helicopters flew over the exposed reactor and dropped sand, lead, boron, clay, and other materials in attempts to suppress the release and cool the wreckage. Engineers, soldiers, miners, firefighters, construction crews, drivers, scientists, and medical workers were sent into a landscape that had become both battlefield and laboratory. These people became known collectively as liquidators. The term sounds bureaucratic, almost bloodless, but the work was anything but. Hundreds of thousands would eventually participate in containment, cleanup, construction, transport, decontamination, and guarding contaminated areas. Some served briefly. Some stayed for long periods. Many were conscripts or workers sent with limited information. Many believed they were defending their country. Many were. The tasks were as surreal as they were dangerous. Roads were washed. Topsoil was scraped away and buried. Forest patches were cut down. Vehicles were decontaminated or abandoned. Houses in highly contaminated villages were emptied, destroyed, or entombed. Domestic animals left behind in evacuated zones were shot to prevent them from wandering beyond controlled areas and spreading contamination. Everything ordinary about life, dirt, leaves, milk, dogs, roof tiles, dust, had become part of a radiological problem. One of the greatest fears in the days after the explosion was that molten fuel and debris might burn downward and interact with water below the reactor, causing additional explosions or spreading contamination further into groundwater systems. Soviet authorities ordered miners to dig a tunnel under the reactor so a cooling system or heat barrier could be prepared beneath it. The miners worked in brutal conditions, close to an unstable and highly radioactive site driven by urgency and uncertainty. Chernobyl created a strange kind of heroism, men risking themselves against dangers no human senses could perceive. Then there were the rooftops. The explosion had scattered graphite, fuel fragments, and other highly radioactive debris across adjacent surfaces. Machines were supposed to handle some of this work. Robots were brought in, including remote systems that, in theory, could keep human beings out of the worst fields. But radiation disrupted electronics. Equipment malfunctioned. Technology that looked impressive on paper failed where the radiation was strongest. So, once again, the cleanup fell back on the oldest technology available, the human body. Young soldiers and workers ran out onto the roofs for seconds at a time. They wore protective gear that helped only so much. Their job was brutally simple: grab or shovel debris, throw it back into the reactor ruins, and run back to shelter before their permitted exposure time ended. They were sometimes called bio-robots, a phrase as absurd as it is cruel. It meant that people were being used where machines could not survive. Chernobyl repeatedly arrived at this truth. When systems fail at scale, states spend human beings to compensate. The construction of the first shelter over Reactor 4 became another race against time. By late 1986, a vast concrete and steel structure had been erected around the destroyed unit. It was known as the shelter, though many people called it the sarcophagus. Both names captured something essential. It was a protective structure, but it was also a tomb. Built under desperate conditions, it was improvised and imperfect, but it succeeded in one limited sense. It enclosed the ruins enough to reduce the immediate release and allow the next stage of management to begin. Like so much in Chernobyl's history, the sarcophagus was temporary. It was not a final solution. It was a hurried answer to a problem that would outlast the era that created it. Inside remained masses of fuel-containing material formed by the meltdown and explosion, including bizarre lava-like substances that later became infamous under names such as the elephant's foot. These were not relics of a finished event. They were active remnants of a process still unfolding through heat, chemistry, and slow structural decay. The human cost of the disaster emerged along more than one timeline. Some deaths were immediate and brutally clear. 2 workers died in the immediate aftermath of the explosion and collapse. In the days and weeks that followed, emergency responders and plant staff suffering from acute radiation syndrome deteriorated in hospitals, many of them far from their families and home city. Their stories became some of the most heartbreaking in the entire catastrophe, because they combined courage, ignorance, duty, and institutional failure in a single human body. But the deeper question, how many people did Chernobyl kill, turned out to be one of the hardest questions in modern disaster history. The immediate deaths could be counted. The long-term deaths could not be counted with the same clean certainty. Radiation exposure changes probabilities across populations. It increases risks. It may produce cancers years later, mixed among all the other causes of disease that human beings already face. Statistics become arguments. Scientific caution becomes politically unsatisfying. For many people, uncertainty felt like denial. For scientists, overstating what could be proven felt dishonest. Chernobyl injured not only bodies, but also the public's faith that numbers could settle grief. Some consequences were clearer than others. Radioactive iodine released by the accident entered food chains, especially milk, and exposure among children and adolescents contributed to a significant rise in thyroid cancers in affected populations. Many of those cancers were treatable, and many people survived. But survival does not erase trauma. A child diagnosed with cancer because of an invisible cloud is not comforted by statistics about treatment success. Chernobyl entered family life through scar tissue, surgery, monitoring, and fear. Much of the fallout landed not in the city that bore the plant's name, but across wider territories, especially Belarus, as well as parts of Ukraine and Western Russia. Villages were mapped, labeled, monitored, and in some cases erased. Fields became restricted. Forest products such as berries, mushrooms, and game had to be tested. Farmers learned a new vocabulary of cesium, iodine, and contamination limits. Ordinary acts, growing food, collecting milk, walking in the woods, became subjects of expert measurement. For people far from the reactor, Chernobyl was not a cinematic explosion. It was paperwork, inspections, compensation forms, blood tests, and uncertainty that never quite lifted. One of the deepest wounds was psychological. Entire communities were told that the land under their feet, the milk in their kitchens, and the rain falling on their roofs might be dangerous. Children were separated from home landscapes. Resettled families entered new towns carrying stigma and anxiety. Liquidators returned from service with medals, illnesses, pride, fear, and memories that did not fit easily into normal civilian life. Mothers worried about every fever and every lump. Men compared diagnoses. People learned to live under a permanent question mark. This matters because Chernobyl was never only about radiation dose. It was about trust, identity, and belonging. If the land that fed your family is contaminated, what happens to the meaning of home? If the state that promised safety concealed danger, what happens to citizenship? If the body might have been altered by something invisible years ago, what happens to ordinary confidence in the future? These were not secondary effects. They were central to the disaster's afterlife. The political effects were just as profound. Chernobyl did not by itself destroy the Soviet Union. Empires rarely collapse for one reason, but it exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system with extraordinary force. It showed that a state capable of launching satellites, fielding massive armies, and projecting ideological confidence could still fail to protect its citizens from its own technologies. Worse, it showed that the same state could respond to this failure with hesitation, secrecy, and inadequate truth. Once people saw that, they began to see other failures differently too. Mikhail Gorbachev was already pursuing reforms under the banners of perestroika and glasnost, restructuring, and openness. Chernobyl gave those words terrible urgency. Openness was no longer a philosophical gesture. It had become a survival issue. The Soviet system could not manage high-risk modernity while hiding information the public needed to live. In that sense, Chernobyl was not only a nuclear disaster, it was a political accelerator. It sped up the crisis of legitimacy that was already beginning to erode the state. The accident also imposed enormous economic costs. Cleanup, resettlement, medical monitoring, lost land use, engineering works, and compensation programs consumed vast resources. The burden fell heavily on republics that already had reasons to resent central control. In Ukraine and Belarus especially, Chernobyl became part of a growing awareness that Moscow's priorities were not the same as local survival. National feeling, environmental concern, and political skepticism began to intertwine. The disaster had opened a crack. History pushed on it from every side. One figure who came to symbolize the moral strain of Chernobyl was the Soviet scientist Valery Legasov. He became one of the key public faces explaining the disaster to the outside world, including at international meetings where the Soviet Union could no longer rely on denial. He spoke with unusual seriousness about what had happened, and over time he became more critical of the culture that had helped produce it. His death 2 years later came to embody another Chernobyl theme: the cost of truth inside a system that had learned too late to value it. While the Soviet Union stumbled toward its own end, Chernobyl kept evolving. One of the most startling facts for many people outside the region is that the Chernobyl plant did not cease all activity in 1986. The destroyed reactor was entombed, but the other units nearby continued to operate. Reactor 2 was later shut down after a fire in 1991. Reactor 1 closed in 1996. Reactor 3 remained in service until 2000. Even after the worst accident in nuclear power history, electricity demand, institutional momentum, and economic reality kept the station alive. That fact alone says much about how difficult it is for societies to walk away from the systems they depend on. After Pripyat was abandoned, many plant workers and their families were relocated to a new city, Slavutich, built to house the workforce. Workers continued commuting to a place already synonymous with catastrophe. This, too, is part of Chernobyl's legacy. It was not simply a frozen ruin. It was a functioning industrial site, then a decommissioning site, then a vast engineering and environmental management zone. People still worked there. Security still mattered. Waste still had to be handled. Spent fuel still had to be stored safely. The disaster had not ended. It had changed form. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Chernobyl passed into the hands of an independent Ukraine. The flag changed, the maps changed, the political language changed, but the ruined reactor, the contaminated land, and the financial burden remained. This is one of the most literal ways in which the disaster outlived the USSR independent Ukraine, inherited not only a memory, but a physical and economic problem that no declaration of sovereignty could erase. Chernobyl became part of the difficult inheritance of post-Soviet statehood. Over time, the exclusion zone itself entered a strange second life. On one level, it remained what it had always been since the evacuation, a controlled territory marked by contamination, monitoring, and restricted access. On another level, it became a symbol, a myth, and eventually a destination. Scientists studied wildlife, soil, water, and long-term ecological effects. Filmmakers, photographers, and tourists became fascinated by the preserved emptiness of Pripyat. The zone's silence, its schoolrooms full of books, its apartments full of dust, its trees growing through concrete, all seemed to offer a vision of history suspended. But the zone is not a fairy tale of nature healing itself after human departure. Wildlife did rebound in some ways because human pressure disappeared. Fewer roads, less hunting, no farming, no city traffic, no dense, permanent population. Wolves, boar, elk, foxes, birds, and other animals moved through spaces people had abandoned. Yet contamination did not become harmless simply because trees returned. Some organisms suffered damage. Some landscapes remained subject to careful control. The apparent flourishing of nature tells us less about radiation being benign than about how profoundly human absence shapes ecosystems. A few former residents, mostly elderly, returned illegally or semi-legally to villages inside the broader contaminated zone because exile felt worse than risk. These self-settlers challenged the logic of technocratic safety with a simpler truth. People are attached to place beyond calculation. For them, living and dying on home soil mattered more than statistical hazard. Chernobyl thus became a conflict not only between human beings and radiation, but between bureaucracy and belonging. As the years passed, the first shelter over Reactor 4 revealed its own fragility. It had been built fast under exposure, with urgency rather than elegance. Corrosion, water intrusion, structural weakness, and the continued presence of dangerous material inside meant that the world would need another answer. That answer became one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever attempted at a contaminated industrial site. The new Safe Confinement, a giant steel arch built near the reactor and eventually slid into place over the original shelter. When the arch was moved into position in 2016, it seemed to symbolize the opposite of the explosion that had created the need for it. The explosion had been a moment of uncontrolled force. The arch was slow, measured, international, and precise. It did not erase Chernobyl. It created a safer working environment for the next long phase of dismantling unstable structures and managing what remained inside the wrecked unit. Once again, the world had built something temporary in the face of a problem that would last for generations. Temporary is the right word for almost every stage of Chernobyl. The evacuation was temporary. The first official silence was temporary. The sarcophagus was temporary. The steel arch is temporary too, though built for a long horizon. Chernobyl is a chain of temporary human solutions wrapped around a persistent physical fact. Radioactive materials decay on their own timescales, not ours. They do not obey election cycles, military borders, or ideological slogans. That is one reason the disaster feels so modern and so ancient at once. It revealed how small political time can look beside the time of contamination. The accident also changed global nuclear politics. Around the world, confidence in nuclear energy was shaken. Anti-nuclear movements found new force. Regulators re-examined assumptions about reactor design, emergency planning, containment, operator training, and the international reporting of accidents. Soviet RBMK reactors that remained in operation were modified to reduce some of the design dangers exposed by Chernobyl. The field of nuclear safety culture took on a sharper and darker meaning. It was no longer enough to have technical procedures. People wanted to know whether institutions were built to hear unwelcome truth before it became catastrophe. Chernobyl therefore occupies a strange place in the history of technology. It is both a nuclear story and a universal system story. Engineers see design flaws, unstable operating modes, and failed defense layers. Political historians see secrecy, legitimacy crisis, and imperial decline. Social historians see displacement, stigma, and the remaking of daily life. Environmental historians see contaminated landscapes, altered ecologies, and long-duration management. The disaster belongs to all of these histories because it was never only one kind of event. For those who lived through it, however, analysis often comes second to memory. Memory resides in smaller things. The apartment key never used again. The school notebook left open. The wedding photograph carried onto the bus. The dog running after an evacuation convoy. The call from a hospital. The medal in a drawer. The medical checkup repeated year after year. The knowledge that one April night divided life into before and after. That before and after extended into culture. Chernobyl became a metaphor, a warning, a name invoked whenever states lied, whenever modern systems failed, whenever invisible harm spread beneath official reassurance. Few industrial disasters have generated such a powerful symbolic life. Yet symbolism can flatten reality if we are not careful. Chernobyl was not pure apocalypse. People did not vanish from the region. Workers continued to labor there. Scientists studied there. Engineers built there. Families elsewhere carried on ordinary life under extraordinary circumstances. The truth is more complex than a haunted ruin and more human than a symbol. Then, decades after the explosion, history returned in another form. In 2022, during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Chernobyl site was seized by invading forces. The world watched with renewed alarm as a place already burdened by contamination became entangled in active war. Staff worked under occupation. Military vehicles moved through contaminated areas, including the Red Forest, one of the most radioactively affected zones. Radiation readings briefly rose as disturbed dust entered the air. Later, when external power supplies were disrupted, anxiety spiked again over spent fuel storage and monitoring systems. Even a shutdown plant, even a sealed reactor, remains vulnerable when war breaks the systems around it. That moment shocked people because it proved once more that Chernobyl is not a completed historical event. It is a living site of risk management, memory, engineering, and politics. it can still be made more dangerous by human decisions in the present. The Soviet Union did not survive the 20th century, but Chernobyl survived into the 21st, and then into an era of renewed European war. The disaster outlived the state that caused it, and history kept finding new ways to test the limits of containment. So what finally was Chernobyl? It was a reactor explosion. It was a design failure. It was a management failure. It was a failure of safety culture. It was a failure of truth. It was a mass mobilization of courage and labor. It was a medical tragedy. It was an environmental transformation. It was a political turning point. It was a wound in the map of Europe. It was all of these things at once. Its deepest lesson may be simpler than any technical report. Complex systems do not collapse only because machines break. They collapse when institutions teach people to ignore doubt, conceal weakness, and confuse calm language with actual control. The reactor at Chernobyl was dangerous because of physics. The disaster at Chernobyl became world historical because of human culture. Men in the control room were operating a flawed machine. Men above them were operating a flawed system. Both failed in the same night. And yet it would be wrong to tell this story only as one of failure. Chernobyl is also a story of people who ran toward danger when they did not fully understand it, because someone had to. Firefighters climbed burning roofs. Nurses tended the irradiated. Pilots flew over the crater. Miners dug in suffocating heat. Soldiers cleared the roofs by hand. Engineers imagined structures that could buy time against an invisible enemy. Many of these people paid in health, years, and peace of mind. Some paid with their lives. The disaster revealed the worst habits of the Soviet state, but it also revealed the bravery of ordinary human beings trapped inside that state's mistakes. 40 years later, the silence of Pripyat can mislead us if we let it. Silence makes it easy to imagine that the story is over, that the city is a monument, and the reactor a museum piece. But Chernobyl is not finished. Decommissioning continues. Waste must still be managed. Structures must still be monitored. The land still carries uneven burdens of contamination. Families still carry memory. Politics still revisits the site. The future still has to be negotiated with the past. The Ferris wheel still waits over an amusement park that never opened on time. Apartments still hold traces of lives paused in haste. The steel arch still stands over the ruin, not as a final victory, but as another agreement between human ingenuity and a problem that refuses to disappear quickly. The people of Pripyat were told they would be gone for 3 days. 40 years later, that sentence may be the most revealing line in the entire history of Chernobyl. Temporary words, permanent damage. That is why Chernobyl outlived the Soviet Union. Not simply because radiation decays slowly, though it does. Not simply because concrete cracks and must be replaced, though it does. It outlived the USSR because the disaster entered realms larger than the state that created it. It entered the body. It entered the soil. It entered political memory. It entered the world's understanding of risk, secrecy, and technological power. Flags changed. Borders shifted. Economies collapsed and reformed. Still, Chernobyl remained. In the end, Chernobyl is a warning against the oldest temptation of modern power, the belief that if a system looks confident enough, it must be safe. Confidence is not safety. Secrecy is not control. Routine is not stability. The men who built Pripyat believed they were building a city of the future. In one sense, they were. Chernobyl became one of the defining futures of the modern world. ANC, future in which invisible consequences outlast governments, in which technology and politics cannot be separated, and in which the price of delayed truth is measured in generations. The reactor is covered now. The city is empty. The empire is gone. The warning remains.